What you're looking at is Tony Stewart's final IndyCar ride, and it's hard to believe that it was way back in 2001 for the Indianapolis 500. That was the last time Tony Stewart took a start in an IndyCar. It's amazing because, you think about Tony's career, and it was really kind of supercharged by his participation in the Indy Racing League in 1996. He really turned a lot of heads, although obviously he was already a very accomplished racing driver at that point. In 95, he had won the USAC Triple Crown, Sprint's Silver Crown, and the Midget title, and he was the only driver to do that up until that point. I think now only one other driver has accomplished that feat, and it was a little driver by the name of Brian Clausen. So it just kind of tells you kind of the elite kind of driving talent that Tony Stewart had. But ironically, the driver who was born and raised in Indiana didn't really have a whole lot of success at the Indianapolis 500. His best finish was fourth in 1997. Obviously, he got the pole position, or inherited it rather, in 1996 after his teammate Scott Brayton was killed. But he probably had 5 starts. His best finish fourth, and in this car, it was sixth. However, in 2001, he probably drove a better race than he did in 1997. Now, part of the reason he had such a good race was because he was partnered with Target Chip Ganassi Racing. And how this partnership came together was actually quite interesting. Originally, Target Chip Ganassi Racing, which was the defending champions of the Indianapolis 500 at that point, with Juan Pablo Montoya the year before, was planning to bring both their current kart drivers, to Indianapolis to run them in the 500, since they'd had such success with Montoya the previous year. Those drivers were Bruno Junqueira and Nicholas Manassian. But late kind of in the process, Ganassi realized that having 2 rookies at Indianapolis was probably not going to cut it, especially because Junqueira and especially Manassian were underperforming in the kart series. So what did Chip do? Well, he went out and hired the 2 best guys he could to go drive his 2 primary cars in the 500. The first driver he hired was a guy, you probably know who this is, by the name of Jimmy Vasser, who had been driving for the team up until the last year. He'd won a championship with them in the kart series in 1996. However, they couldn't come to terms on a contract for the 2001 season, so Vasser left Target and went to a team called Patrick Racing. Well, as it turns out, they didn't leave on bad terms, because Chip was able to talk Pat Patrick into allowing Vasser to come back for the 500 in the primary number 44 entry from Ganassi Racing. For the 33, and this was a really big boon, of course, Ganassi somehow managed to convince Joe Gibbs, Chevy, and Home Depot to bring Tony Stewart into one of the Target-sponsored entries, car number 33, the one you see here. Now, what's interesting is that once Vasser and Stewart qualified, both of them qualified within the first four rows and were quite safe from bumping. Yes, in 2001, they were still bumping at the Indianapolis 500. They actually entered the backup cars as well and qualified the cars for Manassian and Junqueira. So there were actually 4 Target Chip Ganassi racing cars in the 2001 Indianapolis 500, all sporting this scheme. Now, what's interesting about that is you can imagine that would be a spotter's nightmare. So to combat that, they added these little strips of color to each of the cars. Vasser's car was all red. As you can see, Tony Stewart's car had the yellow flashes on it. For Nicholas Manassian, there were white stripes on the car. And for Junqueira, there were orange stripes for Home Depot on the car. It's kind of ironic that Stewart wasn't the one who was running the Home Depot colors on his car, but I guess since he was one of the 2 primary Target cars, they wanted Target colors on it. Now, you may be wondering, what diecast is this? Well, it's the Action Racing Collectibles, aka Lionel, 1/18 scale Panos. It was produced, I believe, well, it says the model year is 2001. I suspect it was released sometime around 2002, 2003, whenever they finally got it all together and out into the ether. Here's the slipcover for the box. These things come in a lot of packaging. And let me see if I can show it off here. I'm kind of going to flatten it a little bit. There's the car in the race. It's kind of hard. This car had a lot of different, like, little subtle aerodynamic tweaks and and livery tweaks between the race and when it was practicing and qualifying, but that's actually the race car. You can see Target, Home Depot, Tony Stewart, and then, of course, on the other side of the slipcover, you just have a bigger picture of Stewart's car and, of course, the Action Racing Collectibles logo. And then here's some stuff on the bottom and some legalese. So this car is not hard to find. If you want it, you can get it for around $60 to $70 on eBay. I got it for $65 at the Motorsports Show in Pennsylvania. Ironically enough, the guest of honor there was Tony Stewart. I didn't get him to sign this car because I already had something for him to sign. His 1996 IRL car for Team Menard. He gave me a beautiful signature, and actually I got to talk to him, pick his brain just slightly for about a minute and a half. I was actually expecting like a one-word answer from him, but I asked him, what was it like to go 237 at Indy? And suddenly, he kind of got out of that droning kind of, robotic signing things, and he was like, he brightened up and told me about how fast it was and how the car got better. The car got better because it was producing more downforce from 234 miles an hour to 237, and how short the short chutes got. But it was incredible to kind of see Tony Stewart light up like that. But these action cars are kind of famous because of their detail. And let me show you how detailed. Boom. So you can take the front shock cover off, and you can also take the rear engine cowling off of these cars, especially the highly detailed ones. I guess this would kind of be, if you were talking in modern Lionel terms, this would be an elite diecast. But man, could you imagine how much one of these would have cost today if they produced IndyCar and NASCAR diecasts that looked like this? Probably $200, $250. These retailed for about the same price that a diecast will today, $70. It's just amazing to think how much things have changed. So let's go in for some close-ups on this thing because it is beautiful. So here's the front shock detail. I guess you could call these dampers as well. They are very well detailed, and it's just amazing because these actually are part of the suspension. The parts go all the way into the front wheels. So, I mean, these things were just, I don't know how they produced these so well to get them, just working properly. It's an amazing amount of detail that went into these things. Had to cost I mean, these are all die-cast too. I mean, the top, bottom, everything's die-cast on these. And here's the engine and rear suspension detail. Now, what's interesting about this is it's got Chevrolet heads on it. This is technically right because it was a GM engine. It was Chevrolet the next year, 2002. But in 2001, this car was an Oldsmobile, or at least it was badged as an Oldsmobile. Ironically enough, they got it right on the engine cover. You can see Oldsmobile. But for whatever reason, I guess they just had the Chevy engines lying around from the 2002 cars they were producing. I have no idea. But you can just see the detail in this car. You just can see the air box coming from the air scoop on the top here, coming down to the engine. Everybody loves the air box, right? You can just see all the wiring and all that stuff going in there. There's the rear. I can't remember if that's a push rod or pull rod suspension. Gearheads, let me know what that is. And then you can just see the wiring going all the way to the gearbox here. That gearbox broke a lot of backs when it backed into the wall back in those days. But just a beautiful, beautiful die-cast. Just, I mean, it's you stop calling it a die-cast. I mean, it's like, I kind of think die-cast is toy. This almost gets into that model territory where it's just so freaking detailed. Just beautiful. Beautiful. Just look at that. Like I said earlier, this was probably Tony's best run in the Indy 500. Like I said, in 97 he finished 4th. He got 6th in this race, last car on the lead lap, but it really didn't tell the story of the race. Tony was actually leading the race 3/4 of the way through, and was actually battling with Michael Andretti on and off for the lead in kind of the later stages of the race. And kind of as the race was getting down to it, unfortunately on the last pit stop, both he and Michael collided in the pits and actually affected both of their races. Mostly not so much because of damage-wise, but because of the fact that they both lost time in the pits. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you like, it allowed Gil de Ferran and the eventual winner, Helio Castroneves, to leapfrog them in the pit sequence. And the rest is history. Castroneves ended up outdueling de Ferran and winning his first of 3 current Indy 500 wins. Well, let's just say that there's some debate on some of those Indy 500 wins. But definitely 2001, Helio got it. And but it's amazing because Stewart and Michael, two of those drivers that are usually up in the top 5 of people's list of drivers who should have, could have, would have won the Indy 500, were both racing for the lead in 2001. Both of them made it to the end of the race. Neither of them fell out with any mechanical or crash issues, and neither of them won. Just kind of, like Tony Kanaan says, the track chooses a winner at Indianapolis, and it never ended up choosing Tony or Michael Andretti for that matter. Here's the driver detail. Some of these action cars you get driver details, some of them you don't. This is one of the ones you do. Obviously there's his helmet design, very Target centric. Of course he did do the double this year. That's how kind of this all came together. I don't remember what he did in the Coke 600. I don't know if he completed all the laps. It was very possible that he did all 1,100 miles. We got a little bit of stuff on the front here. Let's get that off. There we go. And you can see some of the sponsors, kind of a mix mash between the NASCAR sponsors and IRL sponsors. You can see the front wings here. Quite big front wings here on these IRL cars. I'm actually going to show you a Cart diecast here in just a few seconds, kind of compare the looks of this car to the cars that were running in the Cart series at the time. Here's the rear wing, and the rear wing is kind of interesting because Ganassi actually had 2 different rear wings available to them. This was back in the days, again, I feel old, but this was back in the days when teams could actually kind of modify their cars and build things, like actually develop their cars, not just a complete spec series. And they actually had this rear wing, which has kind of got a curvature to the rear of it, and then they had another rear wing, which was kind of had flat end plates, kind of longer flat end plates. They ended up running these in the race. I know specifically for Tony Stewart, they ran this wing, so this diecast is accurate, but just kind of interesting note on that one, that they had different wing configurations that they could run. And of course, Target was throwing so much money at this team. It's amazing. Like I said before, 4 entries, sponsored by Target. I mean, man, oh man. Sometimes you think, how the mighty have fallen. Here's the cockpit detail. It's not quite as detailed as you might like, but it gets the job done. This is a G-Force chassis. I don't think I've even mentioned that yet. Obviously, the Dallara ended up winning the race. There were 2 chassis in the 2001 Indianapolis 500, Dallara and G-Force, or Panos, whatever you want to call it. This is obviously the type of car that won the 2000 race in the hands of Target Chip Ganassi, but it didn't win in 2001. And in fact, the Panos or G-Force, there's another thing. The front wheels do turn, and it also turns the steering wheel in the cockpit. And the other thing, real quick, is that they actually scuffed the tires. If you look at that, hopefully it'll pick up in the camera. It's pretty cool. I mean, they really went all out on this diecast. I think they were expecting Stewart to win because they scuffed the tires like I was showing you guys earlier. I didn't mention it, but they have the qualification tech sticker. I mean, they just got everything. Now, one real quick note about this diecast before we move on to a Cart diecast to show that one off is the fact that when you put the pieces back on, the engine cowlings and the shock cover goes on pretty easily. And it fits flush. But when you try to put the engine cover on, and let's show this off real quick. I'm going to move the camera just a little bit so I can show you this. We'll move in there. So when you try to put the engine cover on, it's hard to get it to fit flush. A lot of times if you just drop it on there, it'll kind of give you that gap. So you almost have to, shove it down on the front, and you can still see there's a little bit of problem. So there's a little bit of gap. You see, if you push down, you'll get a gap there, so you kind of have to push down on the front and then just kind of leave it. That's apparently a design issue because I know my friend Robbie, both Robbie and I bought this car. We cleared the convention out of this car, and I saw in his review he had that engine cover looking quite wonky. So just a note on that. Apparently that's a problem across the board on these cars. So just if you buy one, keep that in mind. I don't know what I could do. I don't know exactly what's kind of causing that design flaw. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, but maybe there's something I can drill on there. So let's take a look real quick at a Cart diecast, and we'll kind of put these 2 cars alongside and kind of show you the differences and why people kind of preferred the looks of the Cart cars versus the IRL ones. Well, I already mentioned Jimmy Vasser once in this review, and I'm going to mention him again because this is a Jimmy Vasser diecast. Now, this one is not a 2001 car. This is a 1999 Cart Reynard. This one, ironically enough, has a Honda engine, which I will show off, as opposed to like an Oldsmobile or a Ford or a Chevy that you would see in some other diecast from Action in these days. This one's also in the super speedway, or I guess you could call 1.5 mile oval configuration. This one has the small wings, but it has the rear wing does not have the blocker in the back, otherwise known as the Hanford device, which a few of the other kart diecast had of the day. This is the only one in this aero configuration that you can get, which is weird. They did several variations of the aero configuration for the kart diecast. Action did. So let's take a look at this car naked. Bow chicka wow wow. So here's the details on the dampers on the front shocks. You can also see the same kind of detail where the suspension pieces go up into the shock absorbers and go actually into the wheel and suspensions. I mean, God almighty, that's just amazing detail. Also, you got some inlets to cool the brakes. On these, this car specifically, this aerodynamic configuration ran at the flat version of Homestead, so they needed the brakes to get into the corners because they were going in at like 230, 240 miles an hour, and they just weren't going to make the corner. This car's a little dusty, I apologize, because it's been on my shelf. But they wouldn't make the corners if they didn't brake, so yeah, they needed those big ol' scoops on the tires to get those brakes cool. And here is the Honda Indy V8. Now, you may notice that this engine looks quite a bit different from that IRL motor that was in the back of Stewart's car. This one is a turbocharged V8 versus a normally aspirated V8, and you can kind of see, I don't know if it's less detail or if this is the way it was in real life, it's overall a cleaner package. There's less stuff all floating around. There's less wires all over the place. The suspension looks a little bit cleaner, a little bit closer. Everything just looks a little bit tighter in these kart cars, just because of the fact that they were demanded so much more out of the car. Actually, the turbo V8. They did call it the Indy V8, but once they didn't race at Indy anymore, they kind of couldn't call it that. But this is the engine detail. It actually looks, yeah, I think it's actually slightly less detailed. There's actually different wiring on this side of the engine from the other side. And then there's the rear suspension, again, going into the tires, along with a couple of those really tall brake scoops there. Also, the aerodynamic flicks here in front of the rear tires are quite interesting. You got these big, almost wing-looking things producing downforce in front of the rear wheels. And what's interesting, and this is the thing that's kind of ugly about the new Indy cars, the 2018 one, notice how much of the rear wheel you can see. The new Indy cars have the big box in front of those things because they need to cut down as much drag as possible. These cars, these kart Indy cars were producing 900 to 1,000 horsepower, and they didn't have to run all that aerodynamic crap in front of the rear wheels. But unfortunately, these didn't. Now they do in real life. Also, just take a look at how small that rear wing is. It's actually bigger than the new Indy car's rear wing, but yeah, that doesn't look like it's producing a whole lot of downforce. And hey, look, the number's bigger as well, for those of you who really love to complain about the numbers. And here's another thing real quick to point out. IndyCar's still using the same design of wheel. Yeah, this is 1999, folks. IndyCar has not moved past 1999 in a lot of different ways. This car doesn't have a driver figure either. It's just got seat belts in there, so you can see. What's cool, though, is that since there's no driver, you do get a lot of cockpit detail. You can see some paint application in there for the weight jackers and bars in there, as well as on the steering wheel. They actually did unique steering wheels for each of these cars. I've got a Richie Hearn and a Michael Andretti as well from this year, and each of the cars have different cockpit interiors. Man, 1999 was just a different era for diecast in terms of detail. So there's a couple of glorious lightning bolts. I hope you've enjoyed this review. I know I kind of rambled on about IndyCar racing for quite a long time, but if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit the like button on it, and definitely hit the like for Tony Stewart's last IndyCar ride, because you're not going to be seeing another one of those for a while. Beautiful cars. Let me know which one your favorite is. Do you like the Vasser car, or do you actually like this IRL car? Definitely the Panos was probably, or the Panos or the G-Force, whatever you want to call it, was definitely probably the best looking of the two IRL chassis in that era. But, when you compare it to this, it's kind of, whatever. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe if you did enjoy this, and we'll see you in the next video.